Stay right there! What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute! Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want!
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. Today we got a very, very special guest, somebody that a bunch of us have been really looking forward to talk to and having on the show. Today we got Dr. Stephen Flowers, better known to rune workers worldwide as Edred Thorson, with a PhD in Dramatic Languages and Medieval Studies from the University of Texas. Flowers has spent over 4 decades bridging hard-nosed philology and lived magical practice. One of his latest titles, The Revival of the Runes, unfurls a 500-year saga of how scholars, mystics, nationalists, and yes, even Nazis, have reimagined the Germanic runes. Along the way, he calls for a new integral runology that reunites academic rigor with operative craft. Whether you carve staves, consult rune lots, or just love hidden history, stay tuned for a tour through 5 centuries of runic revival. But before we get to him, let me introduce all the other rejects with us today. We'll start with you, Lisa. Lisa, the occult reject mad scientist. What is going on? How are you?
How's it going? Good afternoon. I'm really, really looking forward to this. Thank you for inviting me on, the fellow rejects. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with Dr. Flowers. We've kind of come across him several times and looking at different books. And, it was always one of those things. Can we get him on? Like, is it okay? Can we get him? Will he say yes? So we're very, very excited. And thank you for inviting me on. The only thing I need to plug is occultresearchinstitute.org, where some of our fellow occult rejects have contributed to the website, some literary work and research of their own. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yes, if I even do remember correctly, when I was practicing the occult and in the OTO, I even went through, I think, his old 87 or his late 80s book was on runes. So to have him on the show is even just like, what the hell? So, but thank you very much for joining us, Lisa. And we got Jin The Ninja. What is going on, sir?
Thanks, boss, for having me on. And this is an amazing, huge honor. Thank you so much, Nick, for inviting me on with of course, my fellow rejects and Solar Exile, who I guess is like a reject for today. So if you want to follow me, you can follow me on X, Twitter at Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, at Threshold Saints, which is both IG and X for the show account. And I have Robbie Marks and Nick will be on the next release, Karanazan. So that is coming out, Book of Enoch Part 3. And of course, the Grey Lodge. So if you're interested in our speculative Gnostic series, of which Solar is absolutely an integral part of, please join us on Fridays on X Live. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jen. And Ricardo, sir, please let everybody know what your deal is when they can find all your amazing work, sir.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon to all the panel. Pleasure to meet you, Stephen Flowers. I'm looking forward to learn from you today. And everyone can find me at that is on the screen. It's Ricardo Calvero at X. Also visit the Institute for Natural Philosophy.org, where you can find a magazine, you can find many ways to collaborate, and even our store. So looking forward to it. Thank you, Nick.
Oh, thank you, Ricardo. Always appreciate you joining us. And we got Solar Exile joining us today. What is going on, sir? Please let everybody know what your deal is.
Well, my deal is, I'm just some guy. You can find me on Twitter at solar_exile. Friend Jin's, longtime friend of the show, so long time, first time. I don't really have anything to plug, so I do want to say that in my mind, when I think of the father, one of the integral roles is to lead the son to the sort of outer gate of the temple. And sort of in that spirit, I think it's a very cool thing that we get to have Ipsissimus Flowers with us on Father's Day. I just thought that was an extra cool kind of synchronicity because he has brought so many people, like uncountably many people, either directly or indirectly through his work, to those outer gates. So it's really something cool. Happy to be here.
Wow. Oh, thank you very much, man. That was touching. Thank you. That got me feeling. So, Stephen Flowers, finally, we got to you. It was only a couple of minutes in, but we finally got to you. Dr. Stephen Flowers, please let everybody know who you are, what your deal is, and I guess whatever credentials you'd like to share with everybody and where they can find all your amazing books.
Well, as far as finding where sort of all my books, published works have been collected into a site, it just all feeds to Amazon. Because that's just, I'm no good at fulfilling orders anymore. I'm too old. But it's seekthemysteries.com. Seekthemysteries.com has all of my work. So anyway, I have followed my own mentors from academia and elsewhere in being quite diverse, I think, in my the kind of books and projects I've undertaken over the years. And sometimes people say, oh, well, how can you go here and talk about that and about Mazdan things and then about runes and then about the left-hand path? But everything that I do comes from a central idea and a central message and concept, and that is the idea of Rûna, of the mystery. And my motto, as it were, is Rein til Rûna, which means seek the mystery, seek in the direction of the mysteries. And of course, that's what the runes are. That's what the word rune means, is secret or mystery. So everything that I do comes from that center of gravity. And so it's really all just one big work with a lot of different appearances. And so many of my mentors, people like Edgar Ptolemy, who's one of the great Indo-Europeanists of his generation, was an expert, and I'm no one like him, I don't claim to be, but he was a expert, for example, in not only Indo-European things, but African, Bantu languages and things like that. He was a Belgian and spent some time in the Congo before he got kicked out in the 1960s. But so that kind of breadth of interest is something that inspired me from the academic world that I spent so many years in. And so that explains why there are so many things and appearances. My teaching, people who taught me and showed me the way, as well as this idea of mystery, which is universal, found everywhere in every culture, except insofar as this Odinic paradigm, this Odinic archetype makes this concept and this thing the central focus of this archetypal task. So it is most fitting to and most illustrative of this quest to look at things through this lens of the Odinic archetype. And mentioning my mentor, Edgar Ptolemy, he was a great expert in the field of the god Odin and wrote articles on the subject, most of them in French. But anyway, he showed me the way in many, many ways that on how to think about things. When I went into school and started studying religion and comparative religion and mythology and all of that sort of thing in an academic setting, I was of the opinion and feeling and thought, as anybody kid might have been in 1973, thereabouts, that somehow paganism was about nature worship. And I see this debated on the internet even today. And this is like the most ludicrous idea one can imagine. It's something that has been influenced by 19th century or earlier critics of paganism and pre-Christian religion, that all the pagans worship nature, but we worship Christ and the spiritual, and that's the higher, and they're the inferior, and so forth. But when we really look back at pagan thinkers, they, whether they are the mythic kinds we see in the Edda in Old Norse poetry, or we look at Greek and Roman philosophers, in every way, in every dimension, these people had much more insight into the world beyond nature than any Christian could ever muster. And paganism, the pagan thinking was Christians thought, well, these people are like studying science and doing all in philosophy, and we just simply believe in Christ, and that's all you need. That kind of attitude and so forth. But he, without me asking him a question, it just quickly knew exactly the question that was on my mind. And he said, absolutely, the pagans, the ancient Germanic people, are not nature worshipers. And that's why my early work in academia and in graduate school, my master's thesis was on the idea of the heroic archetype or hero Sigurd, and how he was his father reborn in in all his powers and abilities. This was the way that the ancient Germanic peoples conceived of, quote, reincarnation, end quote, that through family lines, powers, abilities, and propensities, good and bad, would be handed on. That's like so obvious, or should be, that they're picking up on things that we identify as genetics and other things. But there was a whole psychology or anthropology, better put, in the sense of studying the whole human being, both physical parts and so-called spiritual parts, all a sort of spectrum of concepts and organs, if you will. And these were handed on in a traditional way that were not, somebody wasn't saying, now, boys and girls, here we are in Sunday school, and this is what you have to believe, and this is what the name of this is, and repeat after me, and so forth. That was not the way. It was just the way of living. It was just part of the way in which they existed. And it's those things which I studied, and in so studying these things, the cosmology, the psychology of our ancient ancestors, studying them deeply enough is tantamount to a profound conversion, if you will, because you embody, you absorb these basic concepts. You're not thinking about something, you're thinking from within something. And so that is how academia and, quote, the occult, end quote, it gets fused, in my experience as a young person, when I was around 20 years old, But I was so lucky, it's luck more than anything else, to have the interest that I had, which was in 1972, 3, etc., was very common, much more common than now, as far as just people who really weren't that enthusiastic about it. It was just in the air, it was everywhere. This kind of interest in what we call the occult, mysticism, magic, etc. It was harder to find because you didn't just click something on the internet and find out things. You had to know somebody, you had to spend a lot of time, effort, and so forth. But it was that kind of thing was in the air, a lot of people, but I happen to have interest X, and then to find myself in the place and in the environment of exactly the persons and place where this kind of thing could be accessed in that academic world of the University of Texas at Austin in the early 70s, where we had a Germanic languages department with Edred and others who were dedicated to this. And this mentor of mine, Edred many people will teach even today in the academic world about Vikings. They're more popular than ever, obviously. But people usually treat it as a hoot. You know, it's like, can you believe these wild and crazy guys that do all these things? And aren't they wild? And they're like bikers or something. And they're your professors. Now, we had those too. Treated this whole world as a kind of a bizarre, unbelievable, wacky, out of control bunch of heathens, you know? It's funny, but no, that was not the way I was taught. It was taught that these things that we are studying are serious, important, and meaningful. This is the root of who we are and who we'll always be if we are true to ourselves. And so that kind of attitude of serious, important, meaningful study is something that even if you can find people teaching about this sort of thing in the academic world, very few, if any, have a positive attitude towards the subject matter. And many times it's treated as absolutely, well, it's being forbidden. You know, it's being, the University of Texas today, it was the place where Ptolemy taught, where Lee Hollander, one of the most famous translators of the Edda from the 1920s, was a professor there. And now you can't even, they don't even teach Old Norse anymore. They don't teach it at all because it's, well, you know, forbidden. It's old, dead, white European men, and that's what they say of it. And so, therefore, we're not teaching it anymore. They won't come out. I've asked, so, you know, why did it disappear? And that question, when I ask it of someone, is the last time I ever speak to that person. They'll never answer me or talk to me again before asking that question. That's what happens.
So, Stephen, if you forgive me a question, because I'm relatively new to this, but I would like to ask. So, in your perspective, all of this myths and all of this that sums up and goes into and has the runes in it, you don't think that its origins came from an animistic view where the runes itself are embodiment of the power of nature in some object, for instance?
No.
No?
It is the symbolic power. These runes were invented by a single man. Okay, there was one person who did it. We don't know who it was, but it was probably around somewhere between 200 BC and around the turn of the epoch in that area. He was a poet, a storyteller, a mythographer, and so forth. And that's why this Odinic god form is the god form of the rune using culture, if you will. These things are symbolic of things which are eternal and beyond the experience of the mundane. If you see Old Norse cosmology, where we see it most exemplified, you see these different worlds. People say, oh, Thorson or whoever is imitating the Kabbalah or something. And say, well, no, you know, the great Kabbalist, and I studied that sort of thing when I was young. And at the university, I took courses, a great course, in Jewish mysticism. I studied it quite a bit, and so forth and so on. And it turns out that when you get into the scholarly part of it, the whole tree of life thing, for example, was not really codified until the 1200s in Spain. It's not something super ancient, but it is. It's sort of in the tradition, but it doesn't get that sort of codification till then. And that's, you read the Edda and you see they are describing worlds, and this one is to the east, this one's to the west, this one's above, this one's below, and in words, they paint this picture of these 9 worlds and so forth. These things exist, the natural world exists in Midgard. And beyond that, on the outside of that, is a world of other dimensions. And, you mentioned animism. Well, we have 2 forms of approach. And animism should rarely, if ever, be mentioned apart from another concept, which is its twin, which people rarely talk about, and I hear in these discussions, and that is dynamism. Dynamism and animism. These are the 2 partners in the approach to magic or magical thinking in archaic ancient societies. Dynamism is kind of like animism involves a creature, a something that has a kind of identity. That's why they are characterized under the symbols of animals, dwarves, elves, etc. They have an animus, a kind of a spirit or soul. And then dynamism, something which is a dynamistic power, is something which is like electricity. It's analogous to electricity or gravity, or it is an impersonal force. May the force be with you. It can't be bargained with. It can't be communicated with. It can only be used using a certain, quote, technology, end quote. And these are not separate.
They are part of animism. What you're describing is a part of the animism. So if you go to the descriptions of the Norse mythology, all of it is animism. Is the land, is the power of the land, is the power of the creatures that emerged from the land. Emir itself became the land.
Well, but you have there's a separate concept of the power. For example, the haminya that a person has, their luck, is something which can be, you don't pray to it or bargain with the haminya. You build it through action, or someone gives you this as a gift. Haminya can be laid on someone, and it can be that thing which is inherited, as is the thing, which is inherited from one generation to the next. But I think people have broadened the concept of animism beyond the point where it is a precise definition. So, you can amalgamate dynamistic and animistic concepts, and then you say, well, it's all, quote, it's all dynamism. It's all a force or a power, and sometimes we conceive of it as a pixie or a dwarf or an elf, but it's really just a power. Somebody might argue that.
I see it as a planet, as a cosmos, as an animus equilibrium where everything is connected. I don't see a dwarf or a creature. I see everything. The earth itself, Yggdrasil, each one of the 9 worlds, they are all part of this animism that irradiates forms of power that can be then used by conjunctions of materials like, for instance, the runes. That's my point of view. I'm sorry to disagree with you, but that's how I see it. I'm sorry.
You're converted animism into dynamism. So that's fine, but that's what it is. It's closer to dynamism, the actual dynamos is a Greek word for power. Dynamis is power, and a force.
That power must irradiate from somewhere, no?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's for the point from which it comes are the ICU.
So I have a sort of question, since you brought up the Haminga, and maybe this is it's a parallel question that might give us a different angle to approach this. Forgive me if it's too technical. We can take a step back if you don't think it's productive. Since you mentioned we haven't gone through a full itinerary, we don't need to, of the Germanic soul complex or the varieties of Germanic soul complexes, and I'm wondering which parts of those soul complexes are sort of stabilized and perpetuated in the subjective universe by an initiate. Is it a single part? Is it the sort of what are considered the transcendent aspects of it, the Filga, etc.? Or is this the wrong way to approach?
No, it's the right way.
Initiation?
It's the only way. I mean, that is the way. You have to strengthen these parts of yourself, just like your arms, your legs, etc. If you're an athlete or warrior, the philia, the hamia, the hammer, all of these things have to be are parts of ourselves, and of course, the reality of magic is something that people rarely approach or talk about. When it's really the essential part, and that is that when say I'm going to do spells and do this, that, and the other, well, that's fine. Keep doing it, son. Because that'll render a person pretty not dangerous. But until you say this is how magic is done, you have to get the god, the spirit, the demon, whatever you call it. You've got to come into possession of that. It could emerge from within yourself, like the philia, and you make a bargain, a union between you and this thing, which is irrelevant as to whether it's part of you or from somewhere else. It could be either or both. And that's in the Icelandic tradition. You see, these are the álvar, or it could be the philia, or a lot of other names, but it is something that you get as your parados, is what is called, of course, in the Greek tradition, helping spirit, if you will. And getting that and gaining a relationship and a union with this thing. This is what Crowley called knowledge and or others before him, but what he focused on, knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And this is something, and of course, this is what I'm writing a little study about Crowley and how he, in the famous words of Maxwell Smart from the 1960s, if anybody's old enough to remember, Get Smart, one of his little catchphrases is, missed it by that much. And Crowley, of course, used, his predecessors had used this so-called bornless ritual, which had come from the Greek magical papyri. And it is not intended for the purpose that they were trying to use it for. However, there's a half a dozen other rituals in that body of, which is precisely, pragmatically, and fundamentally intended for that sort of working, to gain this entity as in making it part of yourself. And I just recently finished, it's going to be published by Arcana Europa, a translation, a new translation, because a translation that exists is an abomination, of linguistic abomination of the German magician, sexologist, and all the way around madman, Ernst Schertl. And he wrote a book called Magie. And this is one of the most honest, straightforward, pragmatic books on the subject of magic. And he just fills it out there right from the beginning. Just if you can, work through his prose, which is, you've got to get this connection with, and he just says, with the demon, with the God, whatever, this thing. It could be different ones, different things. It's not all the same. It's not just one. It's your thing. It's something in sort of fate has intended for you or not. Most people won't. Until you get that thing, when you get it, all magic works. Anything works. I do a half-ass ritual. I just think of something and it works. And another person will get his sword and make it up and get all these materials. Of course, most of all that stuff is put into these grimoires as something which ensures that no one will ever have magic that works. And you will always blame yourself because it says, well, if my sword wasn't long enough, or
was it made out of the right material? I didn't make it on a Wednesday.
My inscription was wrong on it, et cetera, so forth. It's always something like that. The timing was all that. That's all put there just to be sure you don't know the secret, which the secret is you get your helper, and then anything and everything works, or can work, as I point out repeatedly everywhere I talk about the subject. A magic is an art. It is not a science. So that motto, the aim of religion, the methods of science is fallacious, because magic is an art. Science is something that no matter who you are, subject X, Y, Z, scientist X, Y, or Z. It doesn't matter where in the world you are, who you are. If you do this experiment, it will work. That's science. That's what makes it science. But the fact that there's a subjective component, that is the subject, linguistically speaking, subject, the doer of this experiment, of this work, is relevant. In fact, it is paramount as to the working or not working of the condition and the character of that subject is essential to the working or not working of the experiment magic working. And so it is an art. Sometimes it is like, what was the chief? I can't remember the chief's name in the movie Little Big Man. He wanted to die and he laid there and it didn't work. And he says, well, sometimes the magic works and sometimes it doesn't, But, and Ernst Schertl wrote this book in 1932, something like that. And it's famous, and the previous translation was really interested in it only because it was in the bunker with Hitler. And he'd been given this book by the publisher when it was published, and he had it with him in the bunker, and it was like he wrote, underlined or emphasized passages and so forth and so on, and did implement, many of the ideas of this development of the magical persona, which will become a godlike creature and becomes then your expression of your own persona and personality and all these kinds of aspects. But there are many other places in there where it's like, hey, Adolf, didn't you read this part here? Where it says you're gonna, if you do it this way, you'll probably destroy yourself and so forth. He apparently ignored that part, but this Schertl is he's an interesting character. He met Crowley one time, this German person, a friend of theirs, a common friend, got them together to play chess. Crowley mentions him, and he says, oh, I didn't like that. He says, apparently he's a pretty a chess master and so forth. So just the way he talks, it's obviously who won that match. But, he's a very interesting person, this Ernst Schertl guy. So that's why I spent this book as a comprehensive kind of introduction to his world, because I was really kind of annoyed by the fact that these other people are just seeing his work, this particular work, in the context of Hitler and Nazism. And the Nazis stripped Schertl of his PhD, and he had to work in obscurity throughout the time because he was a total decadent in the extreme. He was more known as a sex expert on sexuality and sex concerns than he was of magic, per se. But he did write this one extremely insightful book and did practice this idea. But this idea of getting this entity is, I got this other book coming out called The Galdur of Félagh. The Galdur of Félagh, which means the magical fellowship in Icelandic. And it's about Icelandic magic and the pragmatic practice of Icelandic magic, illustrated in part through the folk tales about magic, which are extraordinary documents because these magicians in the Icelandic tradition, they have the stories about them, but magic happens in these stories, but they're not, when people think folk tales, they think of something like Grimm's so-called fairy tales. There's nothing of interest there for a magician, for the most part, because things just happen, right? Like it's in a cartoon or something, like the fairy godmother shows up and waves a wand, something happens and so on. But these stories of Icelandic magicians, they give technical details and technical terminology about how the magic works. And it's not about turning somebody into a pumpkin or something. They're very realistic descriptions of magical workings and their results and how they make results and how people experience this, both from within the subject of doing it as well as the people observing it. They're very realistic, so they do give insight into the workings of this kind of magic, which I translated many years ago, the Galdarbók, which is this sort of grimoire of Icelandic magic. So, but there you see that people are getting these entities. They're called different things. The Pookie, for example, is one. You will probably recognize Pookie. The Irish borrowed this word from the Vikings, and we get it as puka, right? But it's originally a Norse word, Pookie, and it's sort of an imp it's an entity, and if you get it and make it your friend and become one with it, sort of, then you can work through that power, and that's what you see in the Greek magical papyri. Also, that's exactly what early in this papyrus or that, there'll be this working, which is how to get this spirit, how to get this parados, and there's a great book called Jesus the Magician, written by Morton Smith, who was I never looked at that book when I was younger because this is a hokey, what is that crazy? But it's really just a total a study of Jesus, the stories about him. And so, well, what does Jesus really do? I mean, every once in a while he'll preach a sermon to some rubes on a mountaintop, but otherwise, he's performing magic. He's a professional magician. He's a wandering healer, professional magician. That's how he's making his, quote, daily bread, end quote. And so this person studies, so where do we have other things like this? Oh, yes, well, the Middle East was full of these people at the time. And the Greek magical papyri are a record of this sort of thing, a grimoire style. And then he said, well, look at this. The baptism of Jesus, okay, he's put in the water, he's up, a dove comes down, boom, comes to him and says, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." That exists in the Greek magical papyri. There's a whole ritual. We bind up a person, wrap them in a big cloth on a rooftop and so forth, and do all these things. And then a hawk or a bird will come down and hit the person and say, "This is my son." And that's when that entity enters him. When that entity enters the magician, and now he can do all kinds of things. But Sherrill does point out that they don't believe that once you get this thing, that you can do anything, because all these things, if they're real, which they are, have their own talents, abilities, natures. They're different one from the other. So, you may get certain kinds of abilities, but certain other ones not. It's not like, well, I can do anything. It's just unrealistic. But what is realistic is incredibly and unbelievably fantastic.
Lisa,
Doc, I have.
Go ahead, Lisa. Please do.
I have a quick question about runes, and I forgive the elementary of it. You speak kind of the concept that of rune consciousness, like it has a consciousness to it. Would you, for me and the audience, would you say that a rune is a symbol, a portal, or a being? And if you consider the rune as a conscious entity, do they have their own separate entities? Does each rune have its own separate consciousness?
The rune is a mystery. A mystery is a revelation and a continuing concealment of itself. And the reason it continuously conceals itself is it wants you to seek it. And in seeking it, you create more of it. You see, if we say like, oh, here's the revelation, like this means that, that's what it means. Okay, Sam, that's it. It's been revealed. You can go on about your business. See, now you know. Now you know, because I told you. That's not what the mystery does. Mystery says, here's an opening, like a portal, like you said, and this is a pathway to go. Odin says, when he is initiated, in the ordeal on Yggdrasil, there's a saying, one word led to another word, one deed led to another deed. This leading, this going, this dynamic, progressive, continuous pathway is the thing that the runes open and encourage, and that's why they remain a mystery. It's a rune, and Rûna, the mystery, is that is Rûna, if you will, is Odin's Philia. When he is near death in this Yggdrasil initiation, which is done as a form of execution. Right? That's how they sacrifice people, men. That's how the Germanic people sacrificed humans, was by hanging. And that's what our hanging, you said, what the heck? Why did we think of doing capital punishment by hanging people? Isn't that kind of weird? Well, that's the way it was done. That's the way the ancient Germanic peoples sacrificed humans. Who were sacrificed? Well, generally criminals or prisoners of war, not or people who had violated the divine order in some way. And the priests did. The legions of Varus were all executed or sacrificed in that way after the Battle of the Teutoburger Forest. They let the women and children in the company of the Romans go because they weren't combatants. Now, the Romans didn't treat the Germans so well. They killed men, women, children, everybody as an act of vengeance on them. But so he is being executed. That's what's being described as this human sacrifice. He's hanging on a tree, the hanging tree, Yggdrasil. And, oh, by the way, that's how Stonehenge gets its name. Well, a hinge, what does a hinge do? It hangs a door. It's a hanging thing. And that's what the Anglo-Saxons were executing their prisoners of war on, this thing, which looked like a gallows to them. And that's how it got its name. But anyway, he gets near death. He's getting near death. And instead of dying, he meets his philia and then becomes totally and absolutely empowered through this connection, through this union, if you will, with this contrasexual entity, this philia, Rûna, the mystery. And she is always what mathematicians would call an asymptote, an asymptotic thing, which you can see, you can get towards, you can get close to, but you can never possess totally. You can get closer to it, you can get more together with it, but never absolutely, because she keeps pulling you on. Final part of Goethe's Faust famously says, right, when Goethe's Faust is not damned, but is saved in the end. But saved by whom? By God? No. By the spirit of the woman he had betrayed in life, Gretchen. And he says she lifts him up, saves him, if you will, and he's saved by that woman who had been in life, Gretchen, who is the eternal feminine, which pulls us ever onward. Das ewig Weibliche, the eternal feminine. And that's, Goethe was not studying Germanic mythology, but he might as well. He had an intuitive mind that could grasp this concept. But so that's what all of that sort of thing, that's what each one of these runes is. Now, you see that the order, people break their heads over the order of the runes. It's not really that hard once you, every one of the runes are dyadic. That is Fehu, Urus. They are similar things. Fehu is a livestock. It could be a cattle or sheep or whatever, Fehu. And Urus is a wild bison, a wild buffalo type creature that is wild. They're both bovine, right? Fehu, Urus, but they're differentiated by one principle. What is it? Tameness or domesticity and wildness. So they're the same and they're different in that way. Then you have, Thurisas Ansus, a giant and the god. They're similar. They are spiritual entities, archetypal powers, whatever you want to call them. But one is destructive and is bad, and one is divine, good, and so forth. So, Thurisas Ansus. So, and it goes like that throughout the 24. So that that's the poem, if you will. It's like it's a classification system, and that's where you see that people say, well, Germanic peoples must have invented these runes. Well, they did, absolutely did, but it wasn't like made up out of nothing. It was based on the Roman alphabet. I mean, not the order of it, but just the idea of it. That's all a clever guy has to hear. It's like, look. Make a sound, you make a sign, and you make all the sounds you have. You just got to think about it, and then you put them all together. That's why I think, weren't those ancient Egyptians or those ancient Babylonians smart enough to do that? Oh, yeah, they were, but they didn't want to do that because, everybody knows the computer nerd who has proprietary knowledge, right? Keep things as complex as possible. They can never get rid of me. They need me to make their records and so forth. So we're making a writing system that's is baffling in its complexity, cuneiform and hieroglyphics and so forth. When the Greeks just figured out, make a sound, make a sign, and that's it. Every sound you make, put a sign, and that's it. That's all we got to do, and that's writing. And they did it. Greeks did it, and then the Germanic peoples did a similar thing. But notice it's not the same. They could have just used the Roman alphabet. We use it to write our language. Why didn't they use it to write theirs? Well, eventually they would when Christianity came, but before that, they had their own thing that somebody put together into a system which had a lore attached to it, which had a different order, which had an internal poetry to it. And that's why these people were the poets, storytellers, and such of their world, and continued to be so till as long as there was a living runic tradition. That's why my book about the revival of the runic tradition is really not about the older times when it was intact and it was an initiatory body of material. You see, because when you think about runes were used for 1,000 years or more among the Germanic peoples, and no more than 1 or less than 1% of people were ever literate in runes. Just the presence of a runic inscription caused awe and terror. Just the looking at it was awesome and unbelievable. We were really taboo. You stay away from it. It's only the few, very, very few, could write. It was not intended, and for all those centuries, it was not used for a pragmatic, practical purpose. Ever. Not until the Middle Ages, a little much later, when the Latin alphabet was also in use at the time. But so I just look at in that particular book, A Revival of the Runes, it is about what happened after it sort of died out, which it never totally did. There are these areas in Sweden where the runes continue to be in use, and that's where this famous, in Sweden famous, mystic, Thomas Carlson, you may know or heard of, wrote his dissertation on this, which he wasn't alone, and others have written them, on Johann Bure, or Johannes Boreus, who went out into the sticks and found people who knew how to read and write runes, and so they started to interpret these thousands of runic inscriptions, which are to be found in the Swedish countryside. There are thousands of them, 5,000 some odd runic inscriptions on stones that were kind of baffling to people. I thought they would make up silly ideas, or what, to us today, or so, that they must have been carved by Adam and Eve. They're antediluvian. This is some kind of thing because they interpreted everything in terms of biblical lore. But actually, their own recent, not too recent ancestors who carved these things. And you had to find the farmers who still knew the basics of it. And then linguists started to figure it out, to say this is what's going on, this is what this is, and these runes are just, and that's where you see the most important thing we can know about runes directly from the tradition are the rune poems, because these are written by people who know this lore. And so they extensively, they extrapolate on the name and say that's what this means. This is like the symbolism is extrapolated upon in metaphors or kennings, so that they give us direct insight into what these things mean. And that's one of the sort of not so positive aspects, or we could take it a lot further and should and have, of talking about runes, because the early rune sort of writers, treated the runes, that is in the 80s, people like Ralph Blum or whatever, treated the runes like, well, they're like icons, that's it, that's this symbol, and that's all that we really know about it, and I can now make up all sorts of crap about it, in which they did. And that's the way they were treated, like this one thing, maybe a name, it means something, but really there's poetic tradition that is attached to this. Anglo-Saxon rune poem, there's Icelandic rune poem, an old Norwegian rune poem, etc., which tell us directly what people who knew said about it. And that was ignored and completely overlooked by everybody early on, because they didn't know enough. They didn't know somebody like Ralph Blum didn't even read the Encyclopedia Britannica article on runes before writing the book, So that's the way it was in the world of the occultazoid nincompoops.
One thing I did want to ask you, it's a little bit, more on the book. You kind of go through like different ages and times that you look at, I guess, runes, right? And did you want to like maybe touch on a little bit of obviously you want to leave some for people to, with the book, but maybe touch on a little bit of that, or if any one of those, even Nazis or whatever you want to touch on.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mentioned this Johannes Boreas, or Johann Bude. He was in the sailed around 1600, and he did the research and was one of the founders of scientific runology, but he was also a Rosicrucian and a mystic and so forth at the time also. And so he was he's sort of the archetype of what I see myself as combining the science of the day with the eternal quest for the mystery. And so that didn't get followed up on too much historically, but he did set the sort of tone for everything. But it wasn't until the late 1800s that the runes were really well understood by scientists, by linguists, by philologists. The Grimms, founding so many things, the fathers of comparative religion, of comparative linguistics, and folklore, also wrote the first sort of scientific. Wilhelm Grimm wrote one of the first scientific books on runes also in the early 1800s. But that's a constant saga that I carry in this book, is the interplay, non-interplay, between what we really know about runes in the sense of the mundane aspects of it, of this tradition as a linguistic phenomenon, and what mystics, magicians, etc., make of it. And hundreds of years of, frankly, a lot of confusion, right? And that confusion really, to my way of thinking, I mean, don't want to sound like braggadocious here because it could have been done by a lot of people, but the point is it was just never done until I did it, which is to remarry these two things together, which had been, for his day and time, put together by Johann Bude around 1600. but never since then were the two impulses put together. And the podcast here is called Occult Rejects. Of course, that you must know that in a way that's a redundancy, right? Because occult knowledge is rejected knowledge by definition. Okay, you know that. But on the other hand, within the orthodoxies of the occult or whatever, you could have people who are not rejected, who are orthodox and are towing the line, with what the group says you ought to think, believe, and do. That's one of the things you at the present moment are speaking with one of the greatest rejects that you'll ever speak to, because I'm rejected by everyone. I mean, there are people who appreciate it. I mean, I appreciate that people do, and that's my I'm happy to have that understanding. It's not something I'm running from, but the academic world rejects me because I take this kind of study. I follow my mentor in saying and thinking we are doing things here which are serious, important, and meaningful. And most academics today, when you got into whether you're talking about a Viking or a rune, is saying, oh, it's a bunch of silly nonsense, but it's a great way to make a living. And as long as I keep towing the line here at the academic department and say the right things and have the right opinions, feelings, and thoughts, feelings, and so forth, I can keep this job, and they do. But that's I'm rejected because I think it means something and it's important and meaningful in the academic world. In the occult world, I generally rejected because I have this notion of authenticity and the idea that it's something that belongs to us, that it's this idea that's politically incorrect to say that the body and the soul and the spirit are unified. They say, well, that's fine, as long as you're talking about you here right now sitting in the yoga studio. But at the point where you say, my father, my grandfather, and all of my ancestors are all connected and holistically connected to me similarly, that sounds racist to me. And that's interpreted that way. One time, early on, one of my lieutenants, if you will, a Rune Guild member, went over to a place where Ralph Blum was giving a talk, selling his latest book. And I told this guy, Futhark had come out by then by a year or so. And I told this guy to go over to this place, this venue where this guy was speaking just across the street from the university. And when the question and answer part comes up, ask him if he's ever heard of Edred Thorson. And so this guy does that question. I'm not there. I'm going to show up later. And he asks him the question, and Ralph Blum says, yeah, I've heard he's a fascist. And this was like, a year or two after Futhark had come out. But I was already known, even before the book was published, in the circles of, the occult world, let's just call them whatever. With the Wiccans, the thises and the that's and the other things. And what it was, so this animosity towards me and my approach was there from the beginning. And the reason for this rejection and so forth is the idea of this authenticity. One thing people say, well, generally in the occult world, you find that there are people who have who like things to be extremely vague, and while insisting they are a tradition that's been handed down from the Stone Age, and we have the real tradition, and da-da-da-da-da. Well, it looks a whole lot like Aleister Crowley to me. Well, no, it's from the Stone Age. That kind of a thing. And so as Azatru, the kind of was mentioned by one of the critics early on, is saying it's that religion with homework, because we say, look, we can find out important things, really meaningful, profound things by studying old languages and old poetic texts and so forth. They're right here. They've just been ignored and not used in favor of something that nobody's ever heard of before. I had a book, I have a book out, not a famous book, but a book called Hermetic Magic, you might have seen. And I submitted that book to Llewellyn because I really wrote it for them. Carl Weschke and I were really good buddies, but nobody in his company liked me at all, but he did. But then he was kind of had to make the company men happy. And so he sent it around to people in his company to say, what about this book, Hermetic Magic? And they said, well, we don't like it. Why is that? I have all these letters, This says, well, he quotes from German sources that we've never heard of. And he says things we've never heard before. That was grounds for rejection in the occult orthodoxy. You see, you would think, wouldn't you think, that someone who's interested in what is hidden, who's interested in the occult, in quotes, would want to hear something that they'd never heard before, would want to get something, a new insight, but no, that's not true. What people want to hear is what they already know. That makes them happy. That makes them think you're really a clever, intelligent man.
I'll talk to myself all day if I want to do that.
But that is the way. I'm not saying, it's sort of a truism, but when you get into it, like this little anecdote I just told, you see how it works, how it is real, And of course, that's one of the things that's about self-publishing. The world we live in now is kind of liberated people. Now it's a free-for-all, and that's one of my old professors. We're entering into a new dark age, and he foresaw what is happening, that the dark age will be, in the inception of it, and its nature will be such that the truth, or the good stuff, let's just say, is so buried under a bunch of, bull, that it'll be impossible to find. It's not that it's not there, it's that it's been swamped by things. And then who trains the mind of the young heads full of mush to be able to discriminate? That is eliminated also. The critical thinking, not using the Frankfurt School definition of critical, but the actual definition of critical with criteria, using critical thinking skills to say this is more reliable than that, and this is why, and so forth. Those skills have been greatly diminished in our society. And the supply of craziness has been so amped up that I would say that professor was a prophetic man, saying we are entering into a new dark age. Masquerading is in a world of enlightenment.
Oh, man, you just nailed it. Masquerading.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's...
But it's still, but I think that in the... that it could be that that there is good things on the horizon, in the sense that's really the missing element is the idea of education, of training minds to think in the good old fashioned critical way, with good evidence and good theories and so forth, that get at the truth about what is meaningful, important, and so forth, that sort of thing. And then to that end, this is my greatest project coming up. I'm just starting it. A thing called the Wood Harrow School, in which now I'm 72 years old. I could not get a job in academia for the reasons I've kind of alluded to. But I wrote a lot of books, over 50 of them now. But I never got to teach, what I was trained to teach. And so now, with the technology that exists, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to have a school. We're going to have basic courses, and I'm going to teach all of the things that I was taught and that I also taught for several years in the university, and have a coherent curriculum for the training of someone in old Germanic studies. For example, my Professor Polomé, I mentioned before, had this whole series of courses on early Germanic culture, migration age, Viking age, whole courses in that. And I took everything, and he, of course, a man like that in our academic world are referred to in the German world as he is my Doktorvater, they call him, which is a doctor father. He is your father in academia. He is, the alma mater is your university, but then you have a Doktorvater who is your sort of the man who initiates you and who is your mentor. And so a lot of what I do is a carrying on of his teaching to me. And I want to pass that on. Now I'm 72 years old. A lot of guys died at that age, and so this is my big project on the horizon, is to do this. Say, recording, be complete. It's not just like, because I hear these things on the internet. They say, I'm going to teach you about old Germanic tradition, or whatever it is they say. They said, it's going to be 6 hours of lecture. You won't believe it. What's going to happen here is going to be so tremendous. Are you kidding me? Is that a university course, even one? No.
That's like 3 classes, maybe.
16 weeks, 3 days a week, 3 hours for 16 weeks. This is, and that's, I'm not going to shortchange people. That's what they're going to get. They're at that kind and level of teaching. And I did teach at the university level for 5 years. So I'm well aware of how it's done and what to do. But it's not being done, despite the fact that the technology exists for this kind of thing, no one is doing it. And the reason why they're not doing it is because the younger generation, people who still have the energy to do it, weren't taught that way, And so there's only the old school, the old geezers. I have a couple of friends who caught the old guard, at the last minute just before they retired, and we got some people, through the PhD program. That's one of the things about the Rune Guild. I was just incredibly pleased to see. It wasn't something I said, this is what you ought to do. It's just kind of leading by example, I suppose, that we have 7 PhDs in our midst, from major universities. Now, one time I was at a sort of this pagan gathering, and this guy was there, just this old guy. He was older than me at the time, and it was a druid, he said, and he had like a straw hat with a bunch of artificial flowers around the rim of the hat. And he said, "This is Dr. Flowers." He said, "Oh, I'm a PhD also. And I said, oh, and I asked the natural question, oh, where did you go to school? You know, I mean, that's what your first question you want to ask. Where did you go? And he goes, and he looks up, you know, kind of glances up in the sky and he goes, oh, God, what was the name of that place? Of course, it was some kind of, you know, correspondence course or something, you know. This was like decades ago, so it wasn't on the internet, I don't think. But, you know, that was selling, you're a doctor of Druidism, you know, or whatever. And of course, that's become quite common but you can only pass on what you got. It's kind of like that thing with the magical entities I was talking about. You can only be who's informing you. I mean, there's a chain of and that's what tradition is all about. It's not so many people focus on papers and I got a license to do this, you know, from so-and-so, you know, some kind of Masonic thing, like that kind of a deal. But it's about people, connection, real beings, talking about animism, real beings and your connection to them. They could be human. They could be something other than human. My connection first started with getting the spirit when Odin spoke to me. This is nothing new. It's shocking for anyone here to hear. I've told the story many times about when I heard the word Rûna. When the old man whispered in my ear, this is it. And like I always say, when a God speaks to you for real, all he needs is one word, if it's real. And you'll spend the rest of your life trying to understand that word. Okay. Won't be like, well, I channeled this entity and he dictated this whole big book to me. I can't understand what it means, but you know.
I've heard of the magicians say that.
I'm not talking about Crowley here. I'm talking about, you know, the people who, you know, the channeled being back in the 80s or whenever it was, you know, they were these long books, you know, of wisdom from these extraterrestrial beings, and it sounded a whole lot like Madame Blavatsky to me, you know. So
that's interesting what you said about trying to figure out that name. I've kind of heard other magicians, I guess I'd call them, say that before. So when you said that, I was like, oh, I've heard that.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. Lisa, did you say you had another question about something?
Yeah, Solar had a question.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. Just real quick. This sounds maybe like a narrow question, but I think it actually has kind of broad application to magical practices and things. You've written it in a few places, particularly the one that comes to mind is in Futhark when you were talking about the Dagaz rune. You mentioned the mystery of Odin as being this kind of central, you've used the word omnijective, I think elsewhere, this sort of omnijective point at which polarities, dualities are sort of collapsed. And you've written about this not just as an interesting kind of conceptual idea, but as a point of experience too. So this is actually an experiential, state. And I was wondering, because immediately, based on the language that you used to describe this, it evokes the non-duality, the non-dualism that we encounter so often in an Eastern context. And I'm wondering if these things equivalent? And if they're not equivalent, what distinctives do we need to keep in mind to prevent kind of obliterating the particularities in homogenization?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is, of course, a connection between the so-called East and West, and that's becomes immediately obvious when one gets into Indo-European studies. And also, that is that the Veda, the Rig Veda, and the Edda are very closely related, not in substance, although there's in the Atharva Veda, there is a passage which is almost word for word a spell or a incantation that is, we know from Germanic magic, just about the bone to bone and sinew to sinew and the healing and so forth. It's just almost the exact same thing because they are very close to one another. And so the idea that this East-West, sort of a 19th century when we discovered, the Europeans discovered the East, when they figured out, hey, Sanskrit is related to our languages and the whole thing. That there's really not, as I pointed out, or I tried to emphasize I think I did it in Lords of Left-Hand Path, that there's really East and West is a false dichotomy. You could say China or, the Far East is different. But India and the Indian ideas about these dualities, the crux of your question, the idea of these sort of duality between let's just say any duality, is something that is a part of people's thinking about overcoming it, about experiencing it, about using it, but about it being there is something very close to whether you see the Germanic tradition is heavily imbued with this idea of duality. Look at the Yggdrasil, this idea of these 9 worlds and how they are arranged. Okay, so there is a upper world, Asgard. There's a lower, the hell, between up and down, between east and west, between north and south. All of these things are dualism. Okay, but they're not done to say this one is good and this one is bad. They are just kind of the sources of energy, right? Energy. When you like electromagnetic, electricity, magnetism, these kinds of things are sources of energy. What people, the moralistic, the Manichaean kind of perversion, to give a bad name to a good word, but the idea that that there's something good and bad inherent in up and down in east and west. And one has to be good and one has to be bad. Now, I'm a great fan of, I've written 3 books on the idea of Mazdism, the actual Iranian dualism, which was not good and bad, but it is good and bad, but it's not between the things that people normally think of as that way. That is, it's a moral dualism. This, even the most famous critic of good and evil, Friedrich Nietzsche, say beyond good and evil. Well, he didn't say, he was railing against 100 different things that he thought were bad and 100 other ones he thought were good. He didn't really go beyond the good and the bad. He was criticizing the idea of Christian morality, but not necessarily that there's nothing good about the slave morality. That's bad. We don't want to have this other thing. So he was not really rejecting the idea of having a dualism between good and bad things, but rather simply between this idea of being morally good and morally bad. So this omnijective idea that Odin is one that doesn't say, okay, one is good, one is bad. No, they are both sources of power. And so you reach out from your central position to grasp the electro and the magnetic, and you grasp them and you bring them into yourself, and you charge yourself with these polarized powers. And so that is what brings this dualism to a point of, say, a source of power and of energy, not of moralizing between good and evil, rejecting one in favor of the other, etc. But we are full of, in a Germanic mythology, ideas of morality and good and bad and so forth. But we see in the person of Odin, the archetype of Odin, we see the sort of the real, a kind of a criminal, I mean, but someone who has to take responsibility for his crimes. What does Odin do? Well, one thing, for example, he begins the world by killing a kinsman, Ymir, who is this giant who is the universe, as it were, the body of the universe, Ymir. But he's his ultimate ancestor. He's like his great-granddaddy, let's say. And he looks at this entity's world that he has, and he says, I can do better. I can make a better world than this one, than this swamp of degradation that you've got here, this chaos of nonsense. I can make a better world, and so I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to chop you up, and I'm going to use your body to create a more ordered, more beautiful creation. And that's the world we live in now, with all of the miraculous spectacle of the sky, of the night sky, of the sun and the moon, and how they are in perfect balance with one another, and all the things we experience daily. That this beauty that this divine entity created. The whole controversy that people would rage on about between intelligent design and creation and the atheists saying, oh, it's just a bunch of, things just happen to come together this way. And that whole debate, if you will, between God and intelligent design and evolution. And you look at the Germanic tradition, and so we know all about that already. Us Vikings here, that people in the academy make so much fun of, we know, evolution occurred without an intelligent design, and it went a certain way, a certain distance, but then something happened. And mind, consciousness coalesced and became an active force in the universe, and it destroyed what existed and recreated it intelligently. That's what the Edda tells us. There was something there, something evolved, coalesced, crystallized, and acted in a conscious way, and recreated the world in a more sensible, intelligent, and beautiful way. And that's what we live in now. And that's the battle that Odin carries out, is constantly trying to maintain. It's trying to maintain the good order, the good social order, the good physical and order, and so forth and so on. And so that is what that mythology is about. And bring the runes back into it, that is similarly, say like, these Romans have a writing system, but it's devoid of anything poetic or beautiful as we understand it. And so let's take that idea that they just think of as just a mundane, pragmatic thing that they got from the Greeks and so forth, and let's recreate it in a more beautiful and meaningful way. And that's what the runic system is for them. And for us, if we rediscover it, which we have now. But Odin is the embodiment. There's a great academic article from the early 70s called The Psychological and Mythic Unity of the God Odin. It's a kind of a Jungian approach. And the author, Richard Auld, points out that this God is a dualistic. I mean, it wasn't what I wrote in Futhark was influenced by this book, which is this article, which is that these dualities are intense. They're not done away with by homogenizing them into a milk middle ground. No, that's not it. You bring the full power of one side and the full power of the other together, and there you have a dynamic explosion of energy, bringing these things together. So that's what the dualism. Now, you don't generally find that approach as the aim of the so-called Eastern ideas. I think probably originally it was something like that, but of course the religion of the Rig Veda, and the religion of Hinduism, which is its direct descendant, are very different from one another. I mean, the Vedic, the sacrifice, so for what do they sacrifice for? For long life and prosperity. They thought, the people, the Aryan, what I classes say, well, these people were like, Vedic cowboys. These were cowboys. They were cattle herding, meat eating. They've been riding home, in the Yellowstone set, right? These guys that invaded India. They were cowboys. And their religion and Hinduism are very, very different from one another, even though the Hindu says the Rig Veda is the foundation of the religion. It's been completely reinterpreted to say that this world is a world of sorrow, samsara, and we want to get out of it. Please do not, I don't want to be reborn in this hellhole of earth. Whereas the original idea is this world that we live in is as close to paradise as you'll ever find. It is wonderful and beautiful, and we want to be here and we want to stay here. There's a passage, in the Edda, which has where Brynhild, famous Brynhild, is being cursed by Hugnid. Is saying where she's being burned on the pyre with Sigrid, which is this idea you find in India and there, this idea of suti, where the wife is sacrificed with the husband. That's a very ancient thing. And he says to her in a curse form, he says, may she never be reborn in this world, because that would be the most horrible thing. Because what people want to be is reborn here. That's the reward. That's the good. That's what this Valhalla symbol and metaphor is all about. About, well, men will they rise up and they'll fight and they'll die and then they'll be reborn the next day and start all over again. That's just saying that's that kind of life, that kind of dynamism, that sort of life force and living and being and is great. We love it. Where we are now, we love it. We want to keep it going. We want this to continue. That was their attitude. It's an attitude of not of getting away from this world, but they're staying here and being here, and that's fundamentally different. So that's one of the things when you study the history of religion, you see that things haven't always been the way they appear to be, and a lot of things that you think are far apart are really quite close. The Germanic world, Celtic world, also was profoundly affected by the invasions of the Iranian peoples, the Sarmatians and the Scythians, who, when we think of Iranian, we think of the Persians. They really didn't, doesn't matter what they looked like. But anyway, these people were steppe horsemen, the steppe people, which were like the original Indo-Europeans themselves. And they were there in Europe at the time, and Tacitus mentions the Sarmatians and the Germanic peoples. But a lot of the ideas that they brought in and reinforced among the Celts and the Germanic peoples were profound. And some of the things about the cosmology and all sorts of things were Scythian or Sarmatian in origin, it seems. And one of the great sort of signposts of this is that the art form, the interlace art form and things we associate with Celtic and Germanic art are directly of Sarmatian origin, which are these Iranian peoples. And they had a profound effect. I wrote an article in the journal Tyr, which you may have heard of, about the Germanic and Iranian religions and traditions and so forth, and their comparison. Many huge, just catalog of details about, the roosters. I just got a rooster. A friend of ours died, and he had a rooster there, and so we brought him home. So I've had this rooster for a while. And so I named him Parodarsh, which is the Persian word for that. He foresees the dawn. I learned that. The roosters start crowing like hours before the sun comes up. They're not responding. They know it's like a couple of hours. He starts about 4 o'clock in the morning. And that's what this thing is like. The rooster foresees the coming of day, and it calls people to action. And that's what you see in the Edda and in this Iranian tradition in the Avesta. That's the power and the meaning of the rooster. This is just what appears to be a trivial, thing. But you find that they were extremely important to the Iranian peoples. The Greeks called the rooster the Persian bird. It was so important. But these kind of little trivial things that you'll see this one after the other that you find in the Norse tradition and in the Iranian tradition, which seems so far apart. People say, well, how could it be? It's crazy. No, it's not. Because look at that, the Sarmatian, they were intimately involved. There's a whole book on, the whole Amazon, the Valkyrie idea, right? Because the Sarmatian women, for example, so the custom went, had to kill a man in battle, an enemy man, in battle before she was allowed to marry. It's obviously a eugenics program, right? That only a woman of that caliber, that's the origin of the Amazon mythology also. The Scythian women did the same. So, they would be warriors. They were warriors. And that's this idea of the Valkyries and so on. They were real, and women were in the Viking Age did fight, and they did that sort of thing. So these kind of you won't find a Greek woman doing that or a Roman woman doing that. That would just freak a Roman dude out, except a Spartan woman maybe. But for the most part, that is taboo. That is just unbelievable. That can't be. But the Norse people, that was fine. That was, and that's that link. It's not just Indo-European. It's a specific kind of connection between the these Iranian people. When I use the word Iranian, it's like this big, giant world. Scythians and Sarmatians are not like the very different culture, from the hyper-civilized world of Persia. But same people, same group. But so these are. That's always important to realize. I think the history of these ideas and how when historical information can say, oh, this is not. This is understandable and quite clear, stuff where these things come from and how they evolved. But only in later times does it seem that it's unbelievable. This is ridiculous. This is Art Bell stuff, this is crazy. This can't happen. No, it's just an ordinary, pretty clear as to how these things happen. But that's.
I have a quick question for you, Dr. Flowers. Sorry about that, Nick. I just wanted to sort of revisit this idea of the poisonous story, like story misapplied to the different frameworks that are occulted by nature. So you're one of the first people I've really heard discuss like the misapplication of story or history or parahistory to the Rûna, or to runes in particular. But I think this is also important in just a sort of meta-magical lens in general. Like I think that there is a kind of interest, especially from some of your cohorts and some of your proteges like Don Webb and Toby Chappell, in the Lovecraftian mythos. And I'm very interested in like, what are your thoughts on this kind of, I'm calling it appropriation, but I don't mean it in a misappropriation. I just mean use of it by them to describe magical ideas. So maybe words containing the logos of meaning, and they're sort of adopting this different framework to describe it. And I wanted to hear if you had any either positive or negative thoughts on that.
Well, the idea of neo-mythology and like creating subjective worlds.
Yes, exactly. Neo-mythologies.
In other words, to say we are creating, normally a tradition is something which is received from previous, but if you say like, well, this person, an individual, created a new mythology, and now these other people are making use of that as if it were a tradition when it's not. And what I'm saying here is that is a exercise in this, this Odinic principle of being able to create meaning. If you can do that, it doesn't mean that meaning is that the meaning, actual traditional things are insulted or misdirected. It is an exercise in being able to create meaning. And that idea that I was bringing up with the Odin recreating the world. He had a world he received, but he said, it's not good enough. I want to exercise, like an artist, I want to do so. And that is something that you are able, that we are able to do it, and that people do it, and that they find meaning in it is a powerful exercise in, for example, the idea of left-hand path, creativity, right? So that you don't just accept, you don't only just accept what is given to you, but rather you take it upon yourself, if you have the talent, ability, and strength to create, to be a godlike, creates an exercise in being a god. So that's the way I look at it, and I think the way most people within the tradition do. It's
Thank you so much for that.
only certain people would actually say, well, I think that Lovecraft was really into the occult, man, and he was revealing, the truth about something really deep. And he's of course, anybody who knows anything about Lovecraft, that was not the case, son. But the fact that a subsequent generation could could use us in a conscious and godlike way is what is being exercised here with the idea of the neo-mythologies. And creating magical, look at, somebody like John Dee, creating the Enochian system and that sort of thing. It's like, is that from somewhere else? No, it's like made up here, but it's been used and worked. So, that again is a exercise in human creativity. One thing we know, does God exist? Does a God exist? Well, sort of the Setian answer is, well, yes, it does, because you have intelligence, you have consciousness, and he has it, and she has it, and where did it come from? It must have come from somewhere, and we all got it, or most of us got it. It's like Benjamin Franklin, you have a republic if you can keep it. You have consciousness if you can keep it, develop it, and strengthen it. But that is the thing that we say that we have that power. And it does just because we have the potential for that power, and we have the possibility of being able to exercise it in a beneficial, that it is a way in which it helps us, doesn't just make us crazy. It can also do that. That's why, like Michael Aquino said, black magic is dangerous. It is dangerous. And people say, it could be destroyed by the demons. Well, you could be, but they're probably demons of your own creation, But being able, you got to be able to handle the explosives that you're using, with care and wisdom, and to make it so that it helps you and doesn't hurt you. And that's why a lot of people say, stay away from it. Just don't risk it, right? And of course, like I said earlier on here about the grimoires and that sort of thing, about saying your sword has to be so long and this kind of, that was just the seals on the systems involved. So people say, I'm not going to mess with this. It's too complicated. It's not. But that fact is something, doesn't help you, but it can be much simpler. Well, much harder, but much simpler. Does that answer the question about neo-mythology at all?
Absolutely. And just a quick follow-up is how important do you think the Kemetic mythologies or the Kemetic system is to understanding Rûna or the runes? Because we've heard this from several other people.
You mean the Egyptian?
Yes, excuse me, the Egyptian system.
Oh, yeah, so I understand what you're saying, but I just didn't, why, that's cool to use a more native term. But, well, I think that the Egyptian system is extremely powerful, coherent, and the problem with it is, numerous problems, and that's one of the things that some Setians and so forth are the ones I really try to encourage, not directly, but, is to discovering or rediscovering the actual, nothing is more fraught with nonsense than Egyptian things, right? I mean, due to the history of us not knowing how to read hieroglyphics for so many centuries and people making up. Egypt was always important, from the Bible or whatever, always important and powerful and all those things. But most of the stuff that was said about it is nonsense. and it became codified nonsense over centuries of time. And so cutting through this to get back to the, and a lot of it is of the Egyptians' own creation, not just historically, just like the role of Set, being like, oh, he's a demonic, terrible thing. It's like, well, no, he's our, and of course, it had a lot to do with, because he's a god of foreigners, that every foreigner who came there, whether they were Hyksos or Persians or whatever, adopted him as their god, because that was the only Egyptian god that was acceptable to be adopted, because he likes he is a god of foreigners. You're a foreigner, so he's your god. Okay, we'll go with that. Whatever makes you happy, and just keep the peace. But now, recently, this century, Egyptologists have really rediscovered a lot of really important things that cut through the nonsense and make it, for the first time, it's such a difficult thing to understand, because I think that there are no Egyptians, right? Egyptians don't exist anymore. You know what I mean? You understand what I mean?
Mm-hmm. There's no one to really carry their seed, you could say, through time or space.
Culturally, I mean, it was all cut off, and they died out, or they were absorbed. They just lost their identity. When you compare it to, let's say, the Germanic people, or a Roman, or a Iranian, or whatever, that there is or the Indians, or like, it may have changed, but there are people who are the ancestors still live, and so the Egyptians are gone, and so people have for a long time admired them and looked to them for meaning, and so they have made meaning oftentimes when none was truly there, and so that confuses things even more. But through scientific inquiry, through scholarship, a lot of things have been rediscovered. A lot of people have been breaking their heads over Egypt for a long time. Clever, intelligent people, and getting much closer to understanding it than anyone ever has before. And of course, Egypt is so ancient that even within its own cultural continuity, things got lost and had to be rediscovered and revived, even within the time frame of the Egyptian world. So, that's one of the things, like you'll say, it's no accident that, the big sort of scientific encyclopedia of Egyptology is actually called the Encyclopedia der Ägyptologie. It's like in German, most of it. I mean, all the, these, because you look at German philology, science, linguistics, et cetera, and so forth. One of the things was that the Germanic things were so hard to investigate that these clever German scholars had to develop a lot of techniques and methods of uncovering the hidden, uncovering what was not known, by using evidence in increasingly clever scientific ways to make these difficult bodies of evidence yield their true meaning. And they were interesting because, the Greeks and the Romans, they got there, so they speak their language. We know their language. They had all these texts. If you were really interested in pagan Greeks or Romans, all you got to do is pick up a book and read it. It's right there. But the Germans have to find the manuscripts hidden in Iceland somewhere, dig it up. And so in that whole process, they developed methods and of understanding difficult bodies of evidence. And that then became applied to everything, you know, or whether it was studying the Babylonians or finding Troy or doing this, that are just applying these methods to all kinds of cultures. And so that's why, you know, we're using that, and it doesn't happen overnight, but, you know, we have been able to dig up a lot of things about Egyptian culture, religion, mythology that was previously buried under either ignorance or misinformation, made up stuff, you know.
Hi, Stephen. I'm a headless giant, and I just had a couple of points to make on the whole Setian anolatry sort of idea when it comes to Old Testament and Egyptian language. One of the problems that a lot of people find with the Egyptian language is that it's a consonant-only language. So it's not including the vowel sounds that fill out these words. And so a lot of times people will find that they were only filled in with E's, right? So somehow all of these Egyptian words were filled in with E's, and that's probably not the case when it comes to pronouncing these words in the Egyptian language. So that proved an impediment right there, as well as the fact that in the Bible, they refer to Adam and Eve's third son, which would be the progenitor of all of mankind, supposedly, as Set, or Seth in Greek. It was called Seth in Greek. So there is this sort of recurrent Setian motif that's found in the Bible, and also found in Roman, I guess you would call it graffiti, as they were mocking the Christians and the Jews as being anolaters. And so the very first graffiti of Christianity would be the anolatry of Jesus having a donkey's head. And that donkey's head is representative of the god Set. And if you look at the reports from the desecration of the Second Temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, you find that he was talking about this golden donkey head inside of the Second Temple, and also this giant marble statue of Moses riding the donkey. And you've also got the reports from the New Testament of Jesus riding the donkey. And all of these things sort of relate back to this anolatry sort of coming out of Egypt. And we also see that the Septuagint was written in Alexandria, Egypt. So there's this huge crossover between Setianism and the roots of Christianity and ancient Judaism. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, all those things you mentioned. First of all, about the language, I mean, the Coptic language helps us a whole lot on that, you know, since that is the descendant of ancient Egyptian, and it has all the vowels you'd ever want. But the other things are most of the things that, you know, the examples you're bringing up here, you know, are extremely recent by Egyptians' standards, you know, late antiquity and things like that. And as far as the stories may be ascribed to older things, but they are of more recent thing. And the Set, the god Set, the god of the 19th, 18th and 19th dynasties of the Egyptians, you know, is a different sort of creature in more ways than one. And so it has this whole, he's the Martian, you know, the god Mars, if you will, the war god of the ancient Egyptians and so forth. Ramesses, the greatest, probably, I suppose, the greatest pharaoh of all, right? Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, is a Setian. So, and of course, he was, we have his mummy, he's one of the ones we have, and he had flaming red hair. There's all of it. And that's one of the things ascribed to Set and to the followers of Set, is that they are red, based on this. It wasn't because of, you know, redhead, You know, there are stereotypical things about redheads, you know, in general, but about their anger, their volatility, etc. But that's more European kind of stereotypes. And he was a foreigner, you know, the family were a bunch of foreigners from somewhere else. But that was true of so many Setian people. I mean, whether it's like, again, like I mentioned, the Hyksos or the Persians. I mean, you wouldn't say, oh, the Persians are going to worship what was Set, and he's considered to be a kind of an evil god, which is not true. But if he is going to be considered that later, towards the end of Egypt, you wouldn't think Persians would be into that because they're, you know, worshippers of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. So I would.
Well, Set was a slayer of Apep. They had many different myths about the slayers of Apep, this chaos serpent, and so Set was one of the slayers of this chaos serpent.
Yeah. So, but you know that's the Set that we're really, you know, is the Set of Ramesses, let's say. And again, we're dealing with Egypt. My God, there's just thousands of years of history. Nobody has anything, you know, to match that kind of continuity. It's over, it's gone, but there was continuity there for so long. And it underwent so many changes that to make any, you know, that's why you really have to talk about, to be precise about, you know, not about this time period and not confuse the time period, almost confusing late antiquity, Ptolemaic Egypt with 18th dynasty is like, well, you might as well be China and Ireland. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not that extreme, but you know what I mean. It's a lot of differences going on.
There are so many attempts by the Ptolemaic dynasties to try and truly understand the depths of the Egyptian wisdom. And you see that in characters like Cleopatra, who tried her best to learn all of these languages and learn all of these connections, and she really doesn't get a lot of credit for that. I mean, she was very much a scholar and an academic in her time, and people just sort of gloss over that and say that she was so beautiful. She was more than just a beauty.
Yeah, well, that's and think of how many, how long that was that the Greeks were the rulers of Egypt. You know, that the people were the pharaohs were Greeks. You know, mixed. I'm sure they married, you know, intermarried there quite a bit, but that's that's the culture. That's why all of our Egyptological terminology, whether it's a pyramid or obelisk or whatever, are all Greek words. We rarely ever use Egyptian words, if ever, you know, for these things, you know, because it's so impenetrable.
One of the reasons why the Septuagint was written in Greek instead of Aramaic or any of the other contemporary languages is because the hieros gamos between Greek and Egypt was almost, you know, central to their spirituality.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's curious about, you know, traditions about the Kabbalah and that sort of thing is about the idea that, well, isn't it curious? I mean, I'm sure everybody here is somewhat conversant with Kabbalah, you know, just because of it. But, you know, that we think the letters of the Hebrew letters, you know, the Hebrew letters, the names of the Hebrew letters are not Hebrew. I mean, they are in Hebrew, but they're not of Hebrew invention. They're Canaanite. And that's, they refer to Canaanite mythology, not to Hebrew mythology. And so that's why no Kabbalist, no Hebrew, you know, mystic or Jewish person interested in this sort of thing makes use of the names of the Hebrew letters the way that a Germanic enthusiast makes use of the names of the runes. It's just not relevant. They're numbers. But then we go, oh, wait a minute. Numbers and Hebrew letters, they really weren't used as numbers for a while because the earliest manuscripts of the Bible, which have chapter and number numbered, are in Greek letters, not in Hebrew letters.
Isopsophy. Everybody looks over isopsophy. It's so difficult to get people to understand that. It's like this came first. That's what you're looking at. That other form came later.
Right. And I mean, but real, it's one of the things about like real Jewish, real people, and not those who idolize the Jewish tradition, but rather the Jewish tradition people themselves, are like Gershom Scholem, read him. It's like he's like, doesn't shy away from that, but points out, look at, if you go into a synagogue or wherever where, Kabbalah is taught and learned, say this is a continuing living tradition from ancient times. They might not have invented these things, but they created a culture in which they have been continued in a living way to this day. And that is an incredible achievement, culturally, that you have that kind of ability to carry that on. But
this might be very controversial, but do you think that the Kabbalah has more roots in theogony than it does in Hebrew mysticism?
Well, it's Neoplatonism in a Jewish form. I mean, Gershom Scholem says that, basically. And that's what it is. And that's why I was married to a Jewish woman for, she was a Jewish heritage. She really hadn't been practicing at the time, but for 17 years and knew their family, talked to the, relatives from Europe and all that, and they're old geezers, that some of them studied Kabbalah and so forth. And, they were pointing out, this is not Judaism. Kabbalah is not Judaism. The rabbi is not interested in this. We teach this among ourselves. We have our school, and we do this, but it is different from. They understood it as being a foreign body. There are then Kabbalistic sects, the Chabad, the Lubavitcher, Rebbes, and so forth, have made that, but it's not the main body. It's a sect, within Judaism, but it's not the essence of Judaism. We, occultists, who kind of grew up, as I did, in the 60s and 70s, whenever, on Crowley and the Kabbalah and the Golden Dawn, and all, they idolize the Judaic thing and think that this is the origin. The Kabbalah is the origin of everything, and everything is intelligible through the Kabbalah, through the tree of life, and becomes all that, and becomes like a idol, a fetish. But peel it away, so that's not what it is. It's not what you think it is. It's something. It's big. It's fantastic.
I wanted to ask this relative to Egypt, but it actually applies just as well to the Hebrews, the Israelites, whatever we're going to call them, right? Is there something, because people, again, from late antiquity, as previously discussed, all the way to guys standing out at the corner of 125th and Malcolm X right now, claiming to be both a continuation of the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Israelites, right? Do the centuries of sort of like creative interpretations and creative attributions that are kind of built onto both of these, languages, these cultures, does that give them some kind of maybe enhanced magical potential, kind of in the neo-mythological sense, do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, neo-mythological, you take the no matter if something is historically completely nonsense, we create like a egregore. They are like historic paradigmatic egregores where you have things created. Yeah, they've been created, but they've been established and they've been carried on and they've become real. But and then part of the mythology is, and that's probably how a lot of mythology works, is that it is then retro fitted to say this is what it was from the beginning and always was, when it was really a recent invention. But then when that thing goes on for a while, we, as living in this moment in time, interpret it and can feel it as having always been there. That's one of the things about like immigrants are thinking about, like Jewish people, for example, is a good example of this. You know, how in this family I was a part of for a while, you know, you'd see that, you know, they'd come over, they'd be practically, you know, just impoverished and this kind of thing, but their focus on learning and saying, you've got to learn, go to school. And then they would have these family traditions that, you know, your great grandmother was like the first woman to become a doctor in Odessa. You know, it's like all a bunch of nonsense. But see, what they do is they instill it in the kids. This is possible. You did it before. We've done it before. And pretty soon you've got a system working there that goes from we're a bunch of rag pickers, and the next generation we're winning Nobel Prizes. You know?
It's so true.
They're saying, you can do it. We've done it. We're great. We're going to, you know, and you got to learn. You got to learn. You got to study. You got to make the grade, you know. I mean, you got to work hard, but you can do it. It is possible. But if you tell people it's impossible, we're nobody and we'll never be anybody, and forget about it. Don't work. Let somebody do that for you, etc. Those are programs for disaster, for cultural disaster, as opposed to flip it around and you got it changed. You can change it as a matter of will, you know, but you got to apply that will.
Stephen, have you heard of Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West?
Yeah.
That, I think it embodies the idea of the zeitgeist being certain cultural questions. Mm-hmm. And those cultural questions, once they become answered, then the people fall back into that meme of thinking that it's okay to just let everybody else do things for them. And, you know, they can be fine if they just, you know, let other people do the work that they had been doing and striving for until they answered those cultural questions.
Right. Well, yeah, that's why you know, you just got to that's part of the message, if you will, you know, of the ancestors, you know, that we need nowadays is to harken back to those people who were self-reliant and clever and applying themselves heroically, you know, against all odds to achieve great things. And, you know, that's what a lot of, you know, and again, there's a lot of, just like the anecdote I was telling about the people that I know, you know, it doesn't matter who they are, but it does, the paradigms are consistent about heroic models and, you know, thinking that, you know, what is possible and applying that, and all those things are real and very practical. And in individual applications also, obviously, you know, about who you are and what's possible for you, and achieving, you know, that sort of thing.
That's where magic comes in.
That's it. I mean, that's part of certainly changing your subjective universe, and as we see that the subjective universe becomes the objective reality regardless. You know, but it's most interesting to me as to how cultures, you know, individuals, any individual, part of sort of left-hand path or Setian thinking, you know, is capable of just about anything, an individual. But herding the cats, as Dr. Aquino would say, you know, and that's the challenge, right? People think of Michael Aquino, of course, is one of my close mentors and a good friend as well. But you know, thinking, oh, he's a political science, military guy, and all that sort of thing. But you know, you would ask him a question about politics, and he thought, it's like, we don't want to talk about that shit. I mean, it's like, it's really low, really bad and stuff, right? He would just give me a book. I asked him about some politics, and one of his mentors was Raghavan Iyer, who's a professor of political science. And this book he wrote called Parapolitics. Anyway, he would say, read that. That's all you need to do. You certainly didn't want to talk about it. But I noticed in studying him, and just observing him over the years, is that he practiced political thinking in the Temple of Set in ways that the initiates, most of them didn't realize. And if you look at the way in which the organization has flourished and continued, it's this grand working on his part of politics as he saw it, its true application in an initiatory environment, to create a culture. And then we're talking about creating with neo-mythologies, et cetera, and so forth. And I see that in this instance, he was successful so far as creating something that to live beyond him, which has been created, by design. And it's very difficult. You can imagine if all of us have probably been involved in occult organizations of one kind or another, and know, as he would say, it's like herding cats.
Steven, I'd like to ask you about the book then that's sort of on everybody's mind, Mind War by Michael Aquino, that's still used.
Aquino,
yeah.
Yeah,
it's still used by the Army War College. That's one of their required reading texts.
Yeah. Well, he did a lot of things that are, that way. He's the guy who, he's the inventor of it, but, like Apocalypse Now, where they're like flying over with the ride of the Valkyries and all that sort of thing. That was not what was done. People would hear he'd like to play Jefferson Airplane, there, but he was not playing that to the Viet Cong. They had these scientifically created recordings that they were using for psychological warfare on the enemy. But when those same systems, the projection system, was fly back over the American troops, he just flip on rock and roll. And they thought they were like playing rock and roll to the Viet Cong, which is not true. But that's what they were hearing when they was coming back over friendly territory.
How much influence do you think Michael Aquino had over Project Monarch?
I don't know. I just know him as, my mentor. But a lot of the other things what is Project Monarch again?
That was a pretty brutal campaign of psychological warfare going on against Cambodia and Vietnam.
Oh, well,
using a lot of psychologically damaging techniques that I think were developed because of Michael Aquino's book Mind Wars. They built off of it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, well, I'm sure there's something there. Yeah.
If you'll,
but using the word, it's kind of prejudicial or whatever to use the word brutal in context of war. War is brutal. And its point is to defeat the enemy as quickly and absolutely as possible. We've forgotten that lesson.
Especially in the Emerald Triangle with all those drugs floating around. They made a lot of money off of those troops buying the drugs in that area. It was a big profit-driven enterprise.
Well, that probably had nothing to do with the PSYOPs.
It made it easier.
If you'll permit me, to kind of circle back between the relationship between the individual initiate and larger social organisms. At least on a naive level, Setian initiation is sort of definitionally and profoundly individualistic. And I was wondering, you've given us, I think, you're living a concrete example of this answer now, and certainly Michael Aquino did as well. But in more general terms, what do you think? Reintegration, I think, is a word that you, or no, reinclusion was the word you used. Rûna. What does that look like when the initiate is tasked to sort of return to the broader, the larger super individual organisms that he's a part of, tribe, clan, nation, whatever that looks like for him? Does that initiate have duties, responsibilities, etc., to those broader organisms, and sort of what is his place, even as he is a god of his own making?
Well, I think you learn that by example, more than anything. But in theory, always and forever, that's what the initiation. Before we talk about Setian initiation in general, this reinclusion idea goes back in a scholarly sense. Von Gennep's book, The Rites of Passage, Rites of Transformation, that's where that model, is laid out of separation, transformation, and reinclusion. And that was true of every kind of initiatory rite of passage practiced by everyone, from anywhere, universally. And so it's true and proper and beneficial to everyone, because you say that, okay, Setian initiation, for example, emphasizes separation or individuality, and so forth. But the reinclusion part is important for the individual, because you want to create a society, a context, a milieu that is beneficial to that individual. No individual can exist and live in isolation on a day-to-day, everyday basis. So you want to improve the environment in order for selfish reasons, just to make things better and more pleasant for yourself and for everyone around you. So those it would be a short-sighted and unwise thing to just, I'm just interested in myself and everybody else be damned. I'm interested in myself and I want to help others also. There's, as Michael Aquino being sort of an archetype of this to me, as seeing a living example of it, there was, I never met or interacted with or lived around a man who was more saintly than he was. More kind, more just helpful, and in every way. I cannot think of any example of any moment or anything he ever did, said, or anything that was not calculated, apparently on his part, to be a creative of a maximally beneficial environment for an individual to become, and for the world in which that individual circulated, being mainly the environment of the Temple of Set, let's say, to be beneficial to everyone involved. I would, and I notice this is just a little anecdote. I may, write soon a book about him with the cooperation of Lady Lilith, and it's going to be difficult, but he just little anecdotes like this. We would be in conclave. Not all Setians, as I know, comes as no shock to anyone. Don't all get along. there's rivalries, there's animosities, there's all sorts of things. And that's one of the things that he doesn't, this was his idea, herding cats. And we would be in the Magic Castle. It's a place where magicians, the stage magicians in LA, it. And we would have our banquet or some kind of a dinner there for just the few initiates, just like 10 or 12. Forrest J. Ackerman would be there and all kinds of cool people. But there sometimes would be these people that were like not getting along. Myself might be included among those with some other guy over there, And Michael Aquino, I know he was sitting right next to me. Usually I'd sit at his left hand, and you would hear him. People say, "What is he doing?" He's like humming some kind of low tone, sort of sound that was emanating from him. He was just humming or something. And I was watching it, and what he was doing was he was bringing these desperate elements in his presence around the table into a harmonious interaction. He was bringing them into a harmonious, communicative, like they say, communal, And that was a working, you see. I'm not saying he said that, but he would do that kind of thing. The kind of thing of, okay, here we are in the ritual chamber and the bells are ringing and the da-da-da-da-da. That's junior league, He, for example, in this very same Magic Castle, he's brought me, he goes, come on, Flowers, we're going here. And so he took me in the building, he took me down to the basement of the building. And there he reached into his back, his satchel, his thing he was bringing along, and he brings out this SS dagger, the one you can famously see him in the occult experience, talking
in the castle, right?
Yes, and that's what we're getting at here. That he took me down there, and he says, "Okay," and he presented it to me. He gave it to me, and he knows that the Germanic tradition, or he doesn't know, he necessarily doesn't know. This is the miraculous thing about this man, is that he could elicit, without doing research, could elicit all kinds of authentic, magical practices and workings, just intuitively, or as he would call it, noetically, that is rationally intuit, like Platonic thinking, and would say, here, he presented it to me based on my work and so forth, and kind of thing. And where did we do this? In the basement of Magic Castle. We couldn't get to the Wavelsburg in LA. So he did it. See right there, and there it is. And then this idea of you accept a blade from your Lord, as a kind of this knightly. And of course, the Order of the Trapezoid is a chivalric organization, see, with knighthood and such.
Well, the presenting of the blades goes back to the clanging of the swords for Uranos type gods. So you've got Anu and you've got Uranos, and like the sky itself is represented by the clanging of these blades. Mm-hmm. So it goes way back when it comes to that kind of meaning.
Yeah, well, of course, that's your service symbolically here, but in the nights. Yeah, that's like this mentioned earlier. My master's thesis I wrote about Siegfried, and there you see the famous example where Odin comes and puts a sword in this tree, right, in the Barnstalker it's called, and sticks that sword in the tree, and only Zugworth can pull it out because he's like chosen, like this Arthurian thing. But it's a reflection of this courtly ritual in the North, which is and the idea that they say that you're the guy's sword giver and the sword taker. And if you're a sword taker, then you're obligated to the sword giver to put that blade in the service of the Lord. See, that's your tool. It's like I got a automobile repair shop, and I'm going to give you a set of tools, but that's because I want you to do my work. This work from in my shop. That's the retinue, the Lord and his retinue. And that's how the Germans call it a Männerbund. That's the men's societies, the warrior societies that carried on and that's what it was like a very ancient cultural thing, but that's just an example. You're talking about the politics and of this. That's how a master, such as Michael Aquino was, and his point is, I have tried to do is say, my point of being a master is to create other masters. That's what you want, and that's true in just take a guild, like a shoemaker's guild. That's a school, and your point is to make good shoes. And so masters are the teachers, and they teach people how to make shoes, and then they become masters, and then they pass on that. Now, that's part of the whole system. And that we're talking about culture quite a bit here. And that's the idea of building a culture and perpetuating a culture. The techniques are the same, whether that's what a university is. It's a guild of just like a shoemaker's guild, but we have intellectual product.
An excellent book on that theory is The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, which perfectly lays out what you're talking about. A master is one who can train 100 other masters, right? That's the idea behind mastery and how to expand that out into the wider world. So you definitely have the techniques from east to west sort of blending in that matrix that you're talking about.
Right. But I think it's important and to experience it from both ends without experiencing it from one end first, being taught and then teaching and doing so effectively. And again, I bring up that thing about the Rune Guild, which is my school, or my initiatory school that I created. That I see that we have now 7 PhDs there. That's not saying that's right. I've recognized many masters in the Rune Guild who are not PhDs, who are poets and songwriters and all kinds of other things, because there's other ways to demonstrate mastery. Mastery is one thing, but the way in which it's expressed is many. And being a good teacher is one being able to recognize the expressions of others, which are not necessarily one's own, but the degree of mastery is nevertheless equivalent. But the fact that so many in the occultizoid nincompoop world, you find that the masters, so-called masters, are people who are hell-bent on keeping everybody else down so that they can remain the smartest guy in the room. And when somebody said to me recently, or I heard it somewhere recently, it says, hey, if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're keeping the wrong company.
Unfortunately, due to time, people do have to leave. Lisa has to go.
Yes.
You're about an hour over what I expected. I'm sorry to cut you off. It's just that people are going to have to start dropping off regardless.
Once I get started, it's hard to shut me.
It's okay. It's okay. Since there's a lot of, I guess, real quick. I mean, you can check out Jin the Ninja, Ricardo, Headless Giant, Soul Exile. If there's anything you want me to add to the links in the bottom, I'll add it after the show. But I got everybody's links down there if you want to check out their stuff. Steven, was there any place that you want to let people remind people to check out real quick?
Well, just like I said, go seekthemysteries.com so you can see all my books and search. Keep an eye on the Wood Harrow School. It's coming up. What's going to happen there is that I can only take so many students for these courses. That is for an actual certification in what I'm teaching. But the courses can be audited, listened to by anyone. I mean, they don't have to necessarily be part of the school that's in the true, university tradition, and a good university, they let anybody who's just cool, come in and hang out. And that's what I want to have also, but a certain number of students, approximately 20, I will actually take under my wing, and will actually, teach them in ways beyond just what's in the lectures and so forth. There'll be requirements and this, just like a university. So Wood Harrow School is on the horizon.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I appreciate you coming on. That was, I know I even told you about an hour and a half, and we went about 2.5 hours, so I appreciate you accommodating that. Again, everybody, thank you very much for coming on. Some of you were here for the whole time, so, I mean, that was a long one. I appreciate that. And everybody in the chat, thank you. I appreciate it. Everybody chiming in and saying stuff. That's what's up. That's why we go live. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.